the discussion you had was really interesting because it reminded me of one more insight that came out of the Brazilian context. A Brazilian philosopher named Rodrigo Nunes wrote a book called Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, although it doesn't really matter, Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal. And he makes the point that is precisely the point that you made, is that if you build an organization, there is the chance that you will become the thing that you do not want to become. If you use the tools that are actually effective at transforming society, and in this case, he means organization of some kind or another, it is possible that you will become worse than that which you are fighting. That's the game you're playing in politics. If you really want to change society, there's the chance that you will do a worse job than the existing government, than the existing set of elites that you hope to fight. But if you do not use the tools that actually work, organization, then you're abdicating your responsibility and you're letting somebody else decide. And you can do that if you like.
In December of 2010, in a small town in Tunisia, Mohamed Bouazizi, who was a fruit vendor, set himself on fire to protest police harassment. And that set off a wave of protests across Northern Africa and the Arab world in what is now known as the Arab Spring. And these protests have been replicated in many countries across the world, in the global south and the global north alike. On this continent, over the past decade, we have also, we have not been spared that wave of protests, and there's been with increasing restlessness, a youth bulge with high unemployment, high rates of corruption and poor governance. That restlessness has found a voice in some of the biggest mass protests we have seen, in recorded history. However, the record of those protests is not straightforward. So, for example, in 2019, the Sudanese people went to the streets and they ousted the al-Bashir regime. However, just a couple of short years later, this civilian uprising and its outcomes were overturned by a military coup. And now the country is embroiled in a long-standing civil unrest that doesn't seem to be abating. In Nigeria, in 2020, they had the EndSARS protests against police brutality. And even though in the immediate aftermath, the SARS police force was disbanded, activists will tell you that police brutality has not subsided in Nigeria. This year in Kenya, we had the Gen Z protests. This is the largest wave of protests the country has ever seen. And we had people of all generations from all walks of life on the streets. And this was instigated by opposition to the Finance Bill 2024, which was proposing austerity measures that were going to hurt the majority of Kenyans. So in the immediate aftermath of the protests, this finance bill was withdrawn. However, in the months since, those same policy propositions have been reintroduced in other forms of legislation. The cabinet that had been disbanded is pretty much all back in government today. And the country's civic space is more closed than it was before the protests. We have more police brutality, we have abductions, we have enforced disappearances. And the general environment is much more regressive than it was in advance of the protests. So that raises the question of the effectiveness of protests. And it also raises the question of whether there are other tools for political change that we need to be exploring as we have an honest examination of the record of protests. So joining me in studio today is Vincent Bevins, the author of If We Burn. And we have Lewis Maghanga, who is the General Secretary of the Revolutionary Socialist League. And we'll be discussing these questions. And we'll also be exploring in a more broad way, how do we organize to actually achieve the political change that we want? So Vincent, tell us a little bit about the questions that the book raises about the effectiveness of protests across the world. And you can touch a little bit on what have been the failures or the successes of protests in achieving political change across the world.
Yeah, of course. And thank you so much for having me. I have been watching with great interest what's happened in Kenya since the summer. I happened to be with a friend from Kenya as the protests sort of exploded, and I haven't had a chance to go myself. I really hope to go sometime in the next year, so I don't have much to say on that particular issue, but I'm very, very grateful to be invited to have this conversation. So If We Burn is a book that I put together after living through an uprising of a similar type, I think, in Brazil starting in 2013. And also after we all lived through the decade that, as you indicated, the 2010s, as far as we know, was the decade in which more people participated in mass protest than at any other point in human history. Now, why did that happen? Why was it the case that more people took part in protests than at any other point in human history? I think the answer is obviously complicated, but on the one hand, I think you have real discontent across the global system. There's a real feeling that this global capitalist order is not properly responding to the needs of people. There is a real, I think, crisis of representation across many political systems. People believe that those people that are supposed to represent them do not. And I also think that a particular type of mobilization, a particular type of response to elite injustice, a particular type of way to contest the abuse of citizens by people in power became easier than ever to do. And it became not only easier than ever to do compared to the other options, it became believed that it would be a powerful tool for effecting change. Now, the strange reality of the 2010s is that this particular style of responding to abuse, the apparently spontaneous, leaderless, often coordinated on social media, horizontally structured mass protests in public squares or public spaces, did actually deliver change. For decades, the story was that protests, might make some noise, they might get the word out about a particular issue, but they didn't affect real change. What happened in the 2010s is that real change was effected, starting in Tunisia, then in Egypt, and then Bahrain and Libya. But then very quickly, if you remember those stories, it becomes clear that the change that is effected was not what was asked for by the original protesters. And if we step back, as my book tries to do and tells the whole story across the global system, I think it becomes clear that after this real opportunity is created by this particular type of revolt, the final outcome, the type of change that is delivered when these protests get really, really big and disruptive, has no necessary correlation with the dreams, demands, and sacrifices made by the original protesters. If you want to look at what actually happens, it's often a different set of actors that imposes final costs that imposes the final results on a particular uprising. So what I try to do in my book, and we can talk more about what exactly happens in each case or why I believe it goes this way, is that I try to tell the story of the 2010s as if the most important thing to happen in that decade was the mass protest that becomes so big that it becomes something else, that becomes so big that it either overthrows or fundamentally destabilizes an existing society, and look at what happens and why what eventually happened was so different than what motivated the people in, for example, Egypt or Brazil or Chile to risk their lives and mount these explosive revolts aimed at the people that are supposed to be representing them.
Okay, thank you so much, Vincent. So let me come to you, Maghanga, and maybe you can put this background that Vincent has given about the fact of change following protests, but the change not necessarily always responding to the intentions of the originators of these protests. And maybe you can put this in the context of Africa and why, and in it, you can talk about why is it, that even beyond, the borders of this continent and within it, there is this sort of like agitation that rejects organization.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mamka. So yes, in just by extending the conversation and from what Vincent has just said, is that yes, protests by themselves, we've seen them achieving certain amounts of change, and examples as have been given are the Arab Spring. We saw what happened in Tunisia, in Libya. We saw, I think, when you began, you talked about Sudan and what happened. If you look at Burkina Faso, you'd see that in 2014 there was mass uprisings, which led to the resignation of President Compaoré, who fled to the Ivory Coast. So we've seen that protests in themselves can achieve a certain amount of change, but then we see that the limitation is that the change that is achieved does not necessarily reflect what the aspirations of the people were as they took to the streets. So I think that is the example that we can give, or that's the way that we can look at it as we analyze the African continent. We've seen people go to the streets. We've seen people demanding change and resorting to direct action. But we've seen the limitation being that without having a clear and a structured entity that serves as an organization, it becomes difficult for these protests to translate into meaningful change. So when you talk about the reason why people are skeptical to have any organized structures or, to have organizations that are at the leadership of these protests, we see that the reason primarily is because historically people have seen certain organizations taking leadership whenever protests or whenever direct actions are carried out. And we've seen these organizations compromising with the ruling elite, compromising with the very people who are being targeted during these protests. So the people are skeptical because the people are afraid to find themselves in a position where what they fought for gets auctioned. Somebody or some few people end up cutting deals for themselves, and the protests therefore dying down as a result of that. So the skepticism is really an expression of a rejection of compromise. That's what we can say. But having seen that protests without any clear structure or without any clear organization at the leadership end up getting changes that do not really reflect the aspirations, we see that nonetheless it's important that organization guides the entire process. The only thing is that what we need is different kind of organizing that is grounded upon the people, organizing that has been going on even before the protests began. It's not a situation where protests begin and then now organizations spring up to come forth and to say that they are expressing what the people are saying, etc. So you need organizations that are rooted within the people, organizations that have been grounding themselves within the people even before the protests began, and those organizations being the ones that articulate and take forward what the people are saying during the protests. Then with these fears of compromise will really dissipate. Yeah.
Great. So let me come back to you, Vincent, and extend this analysis just a little bit, because this anti-authoritarian impetus, as Maghanga has said, has some grounding in experience, and this skepticism is based on this feeling that those who people choose to represent them do not represent them properly. So then they feel that perhaps we can only show up on the streets representing ourselves. But I think it does go just a little bit further than that. In your book, you talk about, is it called prefiguration? Where the people who go to the streets are even willing to sacrifice the ultimate goals to stay faithful to some forms, to some sort of horizontal forms of organization. You talk also about depoliticization. So can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yes, absolutely. And that analysis, it really does overlap with what a lot of my interviewees told me over, years of interviews that I did, looking back on the whole decade, that we wish that we had organizations that were ready to act, that had been built before the explosion came. We didn't expect an explosion to come. And granting, as it were, an invitation to anybody that wants to join the protest. You don't have to be part of an organization. You don't have to believe with a large set of theoretical proposals, was effective in that it generated a huge amounts of energy on the streets. But once those opportunities were created, it turned out to be some kind of organization, some kind of pre-existing structures that imposed the final outcome. So I don't think even in the most, stereotypically structured or organized revolutions that have ever happened in human history, they would have ever happened without the participation of a lot of people that were not part of some formal association. But in the second phase, after there is either the government toppled or an opportunity for deep reform, it is something like that in the 2010s affected the outcome. So, as I said, going into the 2010s, I think there was a real crisis of representation, which gets to the question you actually asked me. And there's a widespread and totally justifiable, totally understandable distrust of traditional representative structures, the existing states that we have in our global system. There has been this kind of fraying of the bonds of representation. Someone will say that they represent the people, but that representation is imposed upon the people. It has not been granted to the representatives through a kind of thick and democratic process of really coming together and saying, oh yeah, this person can speak for us. We give this person the right to speak for us. We can take that right away if we like. So as we saw in the 2010s, a particular type of protest become the easiest to do given the material and ideological conditions of so many of our societies. It is easier to get people to come together very quickly through outrage and in response to something that has been done to them. It is easier to get people to come together and through this kind of open-ended invitation that is extended on social media than it is to build the type of structured organization that can act in the long term. Now, in some societies like my own, the United States, there are such deep atomization and individualization that organization is very difficult. In other more repressive societies, once you start to build the actual organizations that are necessary, you face violence from the state. So it's just, it is a fact that I think in the 2010s, mobilization became easier than organization. And when we got mobilization of this type, horizontally structured, doing something in the square that seemed to be better than, or that could prefigure a future that was more just than what was in the existing state of things before the protests. There was, in some cases across the 2010s, people that had been very faithful to these ideals that were original organizers, people that really believed in total horizontalism and total prefiguration as the right way to structure protests. And in other cases, you just had these things simply come together very quickly because that's what was possible to do. In the terrain of the political terrain of a given society, the easiest thing to do was to put together a lot of people in the square that were against one thing, but didn't really know each other and may not even agree on much other than the opposition to this particular abuse. And so looking back in the sort of ideological prehistory of this type of protests, people would look to things like horizontalism and prefiguration to say, well, okay, this reflects these long ideals that have been held by some parts of the anti-authoritarian left, that you have to do right now what you want to see in the future, that if representation is broken, you should just reject it. Everyone's going to be the exact same level. There's never going to be anybody that can step forward, go above, and sit down with the existing state, or in more extreme cases, take the place of a deposed state and represent the movement. And in basically, this is a long answer, but basically two things happen after these initial opportunities are created. In the case where an existing government is overthrown and flees, this happens in the 2010s, a dictator gets on a plane and runs away to another country. It turns out that a protest of this type, prefigurative, horizontal, that was so good at getting a lot of people into the streets, is very, very poorly constituted to taking advantage of that power vacuum. So you just look around to see who was ready and willing to take advantage of that power vacuum. In Egypt, it's the military. In other cases, you get imperial counterattack. In Libya, what you really get is a NATO-led regime change operation. In other cases, you get organized and dedicated right-wing forces that are ready and willing in a given country to step into that vacuum. Or in cases where a government might realize, oh, I'm in trouble. I need to negotiate some type of outcome with this movement on the streets. It becomes impossible to elaborate a set of demands to that government that would allow the government to believe that, okay, if I give them this, then it's all going to be over. And then what we saw in the 2010s is governments learning that if there's no solution to this uprising that they can come up with proactively, they can opt for either repression or just waiting it out. Because often this type of or you can do both. You can wait it out and then come back later with repression when there's less heat on you. Because often this type of thing, when people don't know each other, they don't agree on that much, people often have to go back to work. They have to get back to their lives. And if they wait long enough, they can act upon a movement which is now disintegrated because there wasn't that structure created beforehand to act in the long term. So these elements, horizontality, prefiguration, were often pointed to as strengths in the 2010s when they sometimes were weaknesses. I think that they were strengths in some ways, but holding on to them as sort of dogma that should be applied in every given situation falls apart. Because in the history of revolutions, once you start to succeed, there's a counterattack, there's a counter-revolution. And when someone attacks you, when someone goes to war with you, you can't really act like the way that you want to live after the war is over, unfortunately. Yeah. And so a lot of the people that I spoke to over the 2010s saw some of these approaches as necessary and important in the first phase, but not enough to actually create the change that was made possible by the explosive protest.
Yes. So with this, I have two questions that come to mind, and I think there's one for each of you. And I think the one for you, Vincent, would be, why is it that it seems that even though the impetus for organizing, for protest, tends to come from the left, it's almost always a progressive demand, right? That whenever things get boiling, those who are organized enough to, especially as you say, when the dictator gets on a plane, those who are organized to take power are often the right. They're always reactionary forces that are the most organized. So it cannot be accidental that across the world, the most organized forces are on the right. And for you, Maghanga, I'd want you to put this into the Gen Z context. The Gen Z protest context, they famously declared that they were leaderless, partyless, and tribeless. And these broadly aligns with this whole horizontalist sort of organizing that's been happening across the world. And it seems to be ubiquitous across continents, income statuses, that there's just this, the pro-progressive, younger left is the most suspicious of organizing while the right continues to organize. So let me start with Vincent and then come back to you, Maghanga.
No, I'll go quickly because I'd like to hear from him as well about the African context. I think that what happens is that these types of explosive mass protests can force an issue out into the open, and they can make the reproduction of daily life difficult for the government. They can make even the conditions for the reproduction of the accumulation of capital difficult for a government, but they tend not to change the underlying organizational power. They tend not to completely rewrite the restructure who actually has organized power in a given society. And often it was a belief that they might. And so in the absence of what he has already indicated is sort of missing from this picture, in the absence of some kind of organized power that is willing to take advantage of the situation, that opportunity falls back to the pre-existing organized power that already was this society, that already created the society as it was. So I think on its own, what we find is that this particular type of revolt, in its most extremely diffuse and if we take the sort of the most exaggerated, idealized version of how organized and spontaneous this type of a role can be, it does not necessarily shake existing power structures. It may reinforce them because it may provide an opportunity for the organized power that already exists to step into the vacuum, just to double down. And so, there's my answer. I'd love to hear what he thinks about this in the African context.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, let me just add to that question. During the Gen Z protests, even though it was ostensibly leaderless, there were those people who made themselves rather visible and were the people who dominated the media space and quote unquote spoke for the Gen Zs. And whenever they were asked the question of, when the chance of Ruto must go really gained momentum, they were asked, if Ruto goes, then what? And there was never fully an answer. And the sense was that the vacuum would speak for itself. The vacuum would answer for itself. But from what Vincent is saying, the vacuum is very dangerous because often the existing power structures will fill that vacuum and they'll fill it in an even more sort of reactionary way than before. So please put all of this for us in context, Maghanga.
Yes. And, just extending that conversation is that's exactly why they are the ruling class. They're the ruling class primarily because they are more organized than the rest of the society at this point in time. If we were more organized, then we would have been the ruling class. But they are the ruling class precisely because they're more organized. So whenever any sort of vacuum presents itself, they already have the tools that are, ahead of the rest of the society in terms of organization. So that if it's not the government, if it's not the opposition, which really is just a second side of the coin, they all belong to the same ruling class, then it is the military, which really is another expression of the organized violence that the ruling class uses, you see? So the reason why it is always the right wing is precisely because they are the ruling class and therefore they've always been ahead. And it's because at this point in time, they're more organized than us. So that's why they're able to take advantage of this. But coming back to the Gen Z protests in Kenya and, looking at it as you've asked, people talking about leaderless and tribeless and partyless and all that. I think when you look at these slogans, you see that what the youth of Kenya were trying to say is that they're trying to express exactly what is wrong in the country in the first place.
Yes.
And what is wrong in Kenya? What is wrong in Kenya primarily is that you have leaders who are there to serve their own interests and the interests of their cronies. You see? So when they say leaderless, people are expressing the disgust in the leaders, first of all, that exist, but also trying to say that what we want is democracy, what we want is inclusion, what we want is a situation in which everyone gets to have a say in the running of the, of the country. So we want these protests going forward to be conducted in a manner that includes everyone, you see, and the outcome we want is an outcome that includes really everybody. When people say tribeless, they're also expressing their disgust in the present situation in which tribalism has been used to divide the people. So they're saying tribeless because they know the danger that can come in when, the question of tribe gets introduced in the equation. So it's a protest against tribalism when they say tribeless. And of course, when they say partyless, they are expressing dissatisfaction with these present parties of the status quo, which have constantly betrayed the people, which every 5 years keep changing. But really we see it's the same people, but they keep changing. And the parties are not parties of the people. They're not constituted by the people. They're just formed around individuals, you see? So that's what the people are rejecting. So when they say partyless, leaderless, tribeless, first of all, it's an expression of everything wrong in our society. And then it's an expression of what we want our society to look like. We want a society in which, everybody gets a say, in which not a few people, not a few individuals will be the ones running the show. Nobody can say they speak for us. We speak for ourselves. So I think that is what we ought to see. So this really is actually a progressive thing because it shows that the collective consciousness of the Kenyan people, particularly among the Kenyan youth, has gone up. And we see that the Kenyan people really know what they want and they know what they reject They know that they reject compromise. They know that they reject some few individuals usurping their own power and their own potential. And what they want is democracy and inclusion. Yeah.
Great. I think that is that is a very interesting place for us to now pivot towards the other political tools that can be used beyond just protests to advance political change. But before I go there, I think I want to ask a little bit of a provocative question to Vincent about the case of even countries that have progressive governments, even countries that are ostensibly pro-poor. For example, one of the cases you talk about is Brazil under Dilma Rousseff, which is a relatively pro-people government, but nevertheless, the country suffered, or rather, the country faced these mass protests. And there's a direct thread between that and the Jair Bolsonaro presidency. So there is something happening, even, because this rejection of authority is not just happening in cases where the state is decidedly, openly and defiantly right-wing. Even in cases where there's a regime that is trying to sort of shift things leftwards, they can only shift things leftwards within the constraints of a global capitalist system. The dissatisfaction still exists. So before we go into the question of organizing, let's spend a little time just thinking about, does this say something about just the sense that people feel like democracy isn't working? Is this part of just that crisis of representation, even on the left?
I think so. I think that if you take the Brazilian context, which is the one I know the best, the protests were initially organized by leftists and anarchists who wanted to make public transportation cheaper, if not free, for all Brazilians. And then we saw a cycle that was very familiar throughout the 2010s. You saw a police crackdown, which shocked the nation. And now Brazilians had every reason to want public transportation to be cheaper and for the military police to be less inclined to kill people when they felt like it. In the Brazilian context, the police are military police. That's the consequence of the U.S.-backed dictatorship that took power in 1964. So these are all absolutely real concerns. And I think Brazilians also believed that the process of governing was further from them than they had hoped, that the types of representative structures that we have in, as you say, the global capitalist system, even when somebody that used to at least be on your team is in power, because Dilma Rousseff was a Marxist guerrilla who was tortured by that dictatorship. She had struggled to build a pro-workers party with Lula. She believed in protest. She truly I think she actually really agreed with many of the demands. But that rapid scaling up that happened as a result of this feedback loop, where people saw on social media and saw in traditional media the police cracking down on protesters, and then a huge amount of people being invited into that protest, meant that people went who were actually right-wing. The protest actually became concretely, per capita, a right-leaning protest. Now, those people, I think in a deep sense, right, left, they all had something, walk around, go up to any human being on the planet right now, except for a tiny group of oligarchs that control sort of North Atlantic economies. Every single person has legitimate complaints about the system that we live in. Every single person has very real reasons to believe that their life can improve and should improve. That is, of course, very distinct from the difficult question of how to put together a political project that can deliver that and can withstand the inevitable attacks that will come from reactionary forces as you start to win. So it can be a very vicious cycle, because a accurate belief that representation is sort of broken can lead to an anti-representational politics, can lead to an anti-politics, and we've seen this throughout the world too. Let's elect the guy that is least politician. Let's elect a guy that's an actor, or somehow is outside the system because the system is so broken. Well, that person becomes very quickly a part of the system and doesn't transform it in a meaningful way. So you get caught in this cycle of response, apparently spontaneous response, that makes a lot of sense on a surface level. Okay, this is a bad thing, I'm going to do the opposite of it. But it just sort of often can deepen or underline that crisis rather than create a process of real building that is necessary for transformational change, right? Like, I mean, and this goes back to some of the points that he brought up, which got me very excited because they go back to a long history. These are things that have been around for a long time in the discussions of revolutionary theory and the left. That's what's the old phrase, there is no revolutionary movement without a revolutionary theory. Mm-hmm. Just doing what seems to be the opposite of what the bad guys are doing is not enough to construct a new society. Mm-hmm. He mentioned something that comes up in Lenin, that Lenin says that a purely spontaneous uprising will simply reproduce the ideology and the structures that the ruling class put forward. Because as he said, they wouldn't be the ruling class if they didn't have the power to put forward a particular ideology and to defend a given set of structures. If they didn't have that power, the game would have been over a long time ago. Well, there'd be no reason to go to battle in the first place. And then this issue of a sincere and, again, understandable belief that leaderlessness is the right way forward, not only in the 20th century, but in the 2010s, led to the imposition of leaders that nobody chose. People that end up with the loudest voices on social media, people that traditional media go up to and say, here's a microphone in your face. Can you tell me what the people in the streets are here for? That is the kind of imposition of leadership that is not chosen. And often when you get the insistence on structurelessness, historically, what we've seen tragically is the imposition of a structure that is one that you did not choose and that you would not have chosen if you had a chance to decide collectively and democratically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there are so many directions that could take this. But let's go with the personality politics one first, because what Vincent is saying has happened in Kenya, and in the Gen Z protests, where they were ostensibly leaderless, but there were people who presented themselves a bit more prominently. And just because perhaps the media needs to have someone to speak to, they ended up being seen as the representatives of the Gen Z protests. And we know the evolution of some of those personalities since, a lot of whom have been co-opted by the establishment. However, there is this continuing sense, especially on the online left in Kenya, or the online, those who remain to continue to be agitated, who are thinking that they are, who are looking for a savior, who are looking for an individual to come and save them. And that has been the politics of Kenya, that we haven't had strong party structures or systems that have some sort of theoretical coherence that people can look to. So it has always been a personality politics. And so before we even talk about organizing, can we tell us a little bit about what you would say, what your message would be to young people in Kenya who are looking for their savior?
Yeah, I'd say, okay, first of all, it's no surprise that is what is happening, that people are there looking for a savior, looking to rally around someone. It's not surprising because that is the way that this ruling elite, through the system that it's put in place, has oriented people to think. There's a Superman somewhere, even in the movies, the cartoons, there's a superhero coming to save you and all that. So that's the ruling elite imposing its way of thinking upon the people. So people are just victims of that way of thinking. But so what I can say to the young people is that we really do not need to look for any individual to rally around. What we need is to join organizations, progressive organizations. I belong to the Revolutionary Socialist League, which is a political party, a revolutionary political party. I would invite young people in Kenya, for instance, to join the Revolutionary Socialist League, to come together and to try and build these structures that would serve as the people's structures as we continue to agitate for the change that we want. You see? So it's important for young people to join organizations, people-centered organizations, people-grounded organizations that would therefore serve as platforms through which they can agitate and through which they can articulate the kind of change that they want. Yeah.
Okay, so let's stay with that for a little bit. So when Vincent spoke, he talked about the duality of forces that come into play when young people are thinking about agitating for political change. Because on the one hand, there's this mistrust of authority, there's this mistrust of hierarchy, there's this inbuilt sense of depoliticization that is not accidental. Again, it is just part of the superstructure within which we exist in a capitalist world, where you're taught that politics is dirty, politics is for dirty politicians, so stay out of politics. And if you're going to agitate for change, do so in a depoliticized way. And we know there's no such thing. So there's this young person who exists in this context who wants to see political change. However, their approach, is not built for such political change. And then you have these party structures, which often tend to be hierarchical, will be leaderful, will have someone speaking for people, and however, this is also necessary because, as Vincent said, revolutions will meet counter-revolution, and so you need to have an organized structure that can counter those forces. So, to my mind, when I think about a progressive political party anywhere in the world today, it has to wrestle with both of these realities, that you're trying to appeal to young people who are very suspicious of authority and very suspicious of hierarchy. But at the same time, you need to create something that can actually find direction, that can resist attack, and that can actually take power. A vehicle that can actually take power, and that necessarily has to be organized. So tell us theoretically, but also in practice, how does the Revolutionary Socialist League address these questions?
Yeah. So first of all, just buttress the point that I had said earlier, is that the people in themselves, the people without any organized structure, cannot effect any meaningful change. They cannot upset the status quo, and they cannot really remove this, reactionary system that is in place. Only the organized people, only the organized forces can do that. So that's why it's important to join organizations. But so what the Revolutionary Socialist League does to sort of achieve the balance that you've said is that it structures itself in a manner that differs from how ordinary or, this reactionary status quo parties or organizations work and how they are run. Being in an organization does not necessarily mean being in a top-down hierarchical structure. Mm-hmm. What does being in an organization mean? It simply means bringing yourself together with like-minded people, chatting a way forward together, having a program together, and basically just, having or, creating ways of achieving this program together. It's simply bringing yourselves together and being organized. That's what being in an organization means. So an organization such as the Revolutionary Socialist League is a socialist organization, and being in a socialist organization means that whatever decisions are made, they are made democratically. Mm-hmm. Every member of the organization has a say in the running of the organization, in the creation of the program of the organization, in the creation of the direction that we want to take. If there's something that we want to do, everybody gets a chance to participate in the making of that decision. And of course, when we make the decision is binding for all members, because the making of the decision was democratic in the first place. So when people join such organizations which are structured not in a top-down way, but in a way in which everybody is involved and in a way in which the environment is democratic, then they would find their fullest expression in those organizations.
So I have to push you on this a little bit, and I'll push you in two directions. One of the directions comes up in Vincent's book, actually, that in some of the movements that were trying to agitate for, I think that it was the fair hike movement. had this sort of very democratic way of making decisions, but that meant that they were having endless meetings because everybody had to be consulted, reconsulted, and there needed to be this consensus in decision making. And so it was very difficult to make very quick decisions, especially when you're moving through a rapidly changing situation, such as a protest. You cannot be constantly consulting everybody on decision making. There has to be a way in which a decision is reached and it is communicated, and people, the people in the movement toe the line. So endless consultation, so absolute democracy is impractical, especially the larger a movement grows. At the same time, we exist in a moment in history where we can reflect back on some of the organizations that were created with that same impetus for democracy, where those who ended up taking power ended up centralizing the power and usurping the decision-making abilities of the people whom they claim to represent, and reflecting back as authoritative and authoritarian a structure as any reactionary, political party or reactionary state elsewhere in the world. And, a good example of this is the Soviet republics, and the people themselves just rejected this. They rejected even the positive outcomes of socialism. There are these two ends, right, where it can ossify into this authoritarian bureaucracy that itself is rejecting of democracy, or it can be this democratic instrument that is impractical.
Okay, so democratic organizations are not impractical to formulate. Even if you have 1 million members, saying that you're democratic does not mean that now you call a town hall meeting in which you fill all your members and then now you make decisions. There are ways in which every member gets to give their opinions and to have a say, because these organizations which are organized in this way, which are democratic in the way that they work, they're divided into cells, and the cells serve as the basic units of the party. And within these cells, discussions take place, decisions are made. Discussions take place, decisions are made. All these decisions within the cells are discussed at a higher level. So be it a chapter level, be it a regional level, be it a county level, a national level, whichever. So there are ways in which organizations deal with that situation. So, no matter how many members you have, even if you have 1 million members, even if you have 10 million members, it doesn't mean that now you negate the concept of democracy because people are too many. No, in fact, it only strengthens that concept. It only shows what actual people's democracy looks like, even on a nationwide scale. So people always are organized in certain structures within the organization, which then serve as platforms through which they can express themselves. And these decisions are carried forward to higher structures, etc., etc. So, yes.
Practically speaking, though, political parties and states that are ruled with political party formations have to make some rapid decisions at certain points in time. When they're under attack externally, when they're facing crisis. So that tends to be a really good excuse to sort of forgo democracy, and we have seen that in practice. What you describe is good theoretically. But in practice, what we have often seen is that then these bureaucratic structures tend to ossify, and the people who hold power then become the elite.
So again, because of course it's a reality that some decisions have to be made quickly. That's why such parties such as the Revolutionary Socialist League will have its central committee, which has been established by its own membership to make certain decisions and to run certain things, of course, as well as the secretariat. But also, within certain situations, the party can create a political bureau, which is even smaller than the central committee, and of course drawn from the central committee whenever there's need to make certain rapid decisions, to make certain, to give certain directions for certain activities, etc., etc. But again, the establishment of these structures within the organizations are democratic. And therefore, this process itself ensures that decisions will be made that really reflect what the aims of the membership are, you see? that's what it means being organized. So you recognize that sometimes some things will have to be done quickly. So you set up a committee to handle certain affairs, and report back. Of course, these structures do not just operate in isolation. They report back to the membership, and of course, they're also drawn from the membership using certain criteria that the party or the organization itself has expounded. So this, therefore, tries to prevent the situation that you've said, where certain party bureaucrats usurp the power of the entire membership. And yes, it is true indeed that we've seen certain examples historically of bureaucrats usurping the power of the people. But what we are trying to do, for instance, in the Revolutionary Socialist League, is to prevent such a situation and to ensure that even the structures that are set up to act on behalf of the entire membership on certain issues, such as the Central Committee and the Secretariat, the Political Bureau, act on the interests of the membership. Yes.
Great. Well, thank you for that explanation. And I will pivot slightly away from organizing, core organizing, and talk a little bit about the outcomes that we wish for when we want to organize. And this is my moment to push a little bit on Vincent's conclusion in the book, where it seems like you spent a few years looking at revolutions around the at agitation for change around the world, and came out really quite skeptical about the potential for revolution. And I want us to explore that a little bit. So in your book, there seems to be this sort of intimation that your conclusion is that, reform is a much better approach towards the political change that we desire than outright revolution. And I want to understand that a bit more. Is that because you feel that we do not have the structures, or you are skeptical of the sort of organizing capacity or even the theoretical capacity that the left has at the moment to have progressive revolution? And this, sort of fear that any large-scale change will almost automatically lead to a more reactionary outcome? Or is it because you are skeptical of revolution as revolution?
No, I'm not. So I think that my position is not a automatic or inherent preference for one of the two outcomes. I think that what looking at the 2010s leads us to believe is that it is very, very context dependent, and it is okay to decide that revolution is not yet possible in a given situation, or that reform is possible, and that does not get in the way of a long-term revolution. So maybe I know. Again, I'm sort of curious why you thought that I was more sympathetic in general to reform, but setting that aside, I think in certain circumstances in the book, Brazil again was the one that I looked at the most carefully. Afterwards, you could look back on June 2013 and ask, well, why is it that we were destabilizing this government as much as possible if we didn't actually have a clear idea of how we would make it very different and much better? In other cases in the 2010s, I think there was absolutely not only a strong argument to be made for the necessity of revolution, but the possibility of a revolution. I mean, Egypt is one that I think I keep going back to, where there was a real chance. Not only did people believe that an entirely different system was desirable, that it might have even been possible to put one in place with a slightly different set of ingredients in their revolt. And I mean, we live in the world created by revolution. So so there's two things that I would say before I even go to answering your question more directly. One, the world that we live in, as imperfect as it is, was created by revolution. Revolution has been historically an engine for profound transformations in human societies. And I don't think that discarding that option makes sense in every context. And even if you wanted to, even if you believed really deeply, no, that's too dangerous and we don't want to do that, you're going to get revolutionary situations anyways. You're going to get the collapse of existing systems. You're going to get the exhaustion of existing regimes. So I think that revolution is not only going to stay on the table, not only that I want it to stay on the table in certain contexts around the world, but that it will. It will. I think that a point that a lot of would-be revolutionaries, or indeed revolutionaries that I interviewed, made in my book reflects one of the, another one of those truisms that's been around for a couple centuries, that, that famous phrase, those who make revolution halfway only dig their own graves. So the question is not, do we discard revolution in general, but the selection of the moment which you believe that it is possible to really carry out a full transformation, and if you're willing to withstand the inevitable counterattack that's coming. Revolutionaries throughout history have decided, even the most revolutionary, the most classically, famously diehard revolutionaries have made decisions to say, no, right now it would be better if we bob and weave and wait for conditions to change. We're going to have a tactical retreat, a long march. We're going to have to go into the jungle and accumulate forces and so on, and come back later. I think that's the point that a lot of interviewees make, is that you're allowed to select the terrain on which you fight, and you're allowed to select a terrain on which you are stronger than your enemy. Because when we're talking about revolution, and we're talking about even reform, when we're talking about the transformation of political systems, you will have enemies. There are people who benefit from the status quo, and often they got there, as he said. If they wouldn't be there, if they weren't the kind of people that were willing to use force to hold on to their privileges. So I made a couple analogies earlier that were a little bit more apparently pessimistic about the way things have gone in history. But I want to make another that is a little bit more optimistic, because again, I'll say before I even get to that once more, I don't know enough about the domestic political terrain in Kenya. I really hope to come in 2025 and learn more about the competing forces and get to know all the different organizations that exist and get to know what options there really are. I would just love to learn more. But speaking once more very broadly and very historically, it has happened many, many times in history that a revolt that seems to have been defeated, a revolt that seems to have led nowhere in the short term, turns out to be the seed of a larger and more transformative process. The people that I spoke to in my book would not have done so if they did not believe that the things that they had lived through could not become, in a larger sense, the beginning of a more profound transformation. And again, throughout history, often you get this kind of a thing. You get apparently spontaneous, quickly, a revolt that comes together very quickly and is crushed or does not lead to immediate changes. But then if you step back and take a much longer view, real political change, real transformations of societies often take a long time. And this is what happens in the long term. So you can see things that you can see apparent defeats turn into victory if certain ingredients are added to the recipe. And across the world, again, I don't know the terrain in Kenya, across the world, people have come to me and said, well, there are different types of organizations that I have decided to get involved in based on what I think is possible in my country and what the terrain is. And some people join trade unions, some people join revolutionary political parties, some people join social movements, some people join large parliamentary parties if they believe that the democratic process in that country is the most legitimate and feasible way of carrying out given change. But the discussion you had was really interesting because it reminded me of one more insight that came out of the Brazilian context. A Brazilian philosopher named Rodrigo Nunes wrote a book called Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, although it doesn't really matter, Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal. And he makes the point that is precisely the point that you made, is that if you build an organization, there is the chance that you will become the thing that you do not want to become. If you use the tools that are actually effective at transforming society, and in this case, he means organization of some kind or another, it is possible that you will become worse than that which you are fighting. That's the game you're playing in politics. If you really want to change society, there's the chance that you will do a worse job than the existing government, than the existing set of elites that you hope to fight. But if you do not use the tools that actually work, organization, then you're abdicating your responsibility and you're letting somebody else decide. And so you can do that if you like. But just, rededicating oneself to the idea of organization, the task of organization, or the very difficult job of building real collective power doesn't mean that you're going to win. And it doesn't mean that you're going to be the good guy forever. If you're not very serious about checking yourself and making sure that you maintain the type of democratic accountability that you insist upon from the beginning, you can fall to exactly what you hope to oppose. That is the game. So that's a very long answer, but I think that I don't think that reform on its own inherently. I don't privilege it ontologically. I don't believe that. I think it's a question of context. But I do think that if you look at the most dedicated revolutionary, the people that no one doubts their revolutionary credentials, Mao, Che, and so on, they choose to pick their battles. They choose to regroup. They choose when it is the time to strike and when it is not the time to strike.
Perfect. And we are almost at the end of the show. But before we do, I want to come to you and extend that final point that Vincent just made about choosing the moment. And I want you to give us a sense check, basically, of where is Kenya right now?
As regards where we are, there's, of course, certain apparent exhaustion from the young people who were in the streets. But really, if you analyze it, you'd see it is more of a regroup. It's more of a tactical retreat rather than people saying that they've given up. Because when you look, the conditions that took the people to the streets are still there. In fact, things are worse than the way they were even before we went to the streets. The government is even more repressive. The economic conditions continue to get even worse. The government is even more corrupt. Even more corrupt than it was. So it continues, things continue to get worse. But then, yes, so what is apparent is now the need for the next wave of protests to be more organized. And, for there to be a more clear direction that the people follow. Because I think what has been seen is that if we protest without really having any clear and organized plan regarding what is done after the protests succeed, etc., then what we shall have is casualties. And even in the event that the system or the government is replaced, then it's even unclear, the new system that will come in place. So what I'd say in urging the people at this moment is that they should now pay attention to the need to join organizations. So speaking on behalf of the Revolutionary Socialist League, of course, I'd tell people to join the Revolutionary Socialist League, to participate in our political education sessions, to come there and to have discussions really on what the way forward is. As regards, talking about what is to be done at the grassroots level, there's a process of creating people's assemblies through which the people themselves get to say what the issues are, and they get to say exactly what is to be done going forward. And of course, we are participating actively in the setting up of these people's assemblies. So I'd say that much still has to be done, but what we see is that there is need for organization, is that we cannot rely on spontaneity because we're going to have casualties with little results. So there's need to be more organized. The conditions are still there. The people really have not despaired. It's only a tactical retreat, and the struggle goes on. Yes.
The struggle goes on. That is a wonderful final note. So I would like to thank you so much, Vincent, for joining us today. And I will urge people in the notes on YouTube, we're going to make sure we tag your book. And hopefully young people in Kenya, in Africa, and across the world are going to read your book. And obviously, we're extremely excited to welcome you to Kenya next year and to show you the lay of the land. And maybe you'll come right in the heart of action. And Maghanga, it is always a pleasure to talk to you. And, the Revolutionary Socialist League is one amongst a number of political parties, political formations, movements on the left in Kenya that truly have the needs of Kenyans at heart. So young Kenyans out there looking at the political landscape, don't feel stuck on UDA and ODM, and as though those are the only options. There are a lot of options, and we urge you to seek out these options and organize. Because, and I'll finish with a paraphrasing of what Marx says in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, where he says that those who do not represent themselves will be represented. So if you do not enter political formations and choose your own leaders, leaders will be chosen for you. And they may not be the leaders you want. So on that note, dear listeners and dear viewers, please, look out for our next episode that will be coming in the new year. And thank you very much to Vincent and Maghanga.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for this conversation.